Today on the PIO podcast, I would like to introduce Scott Mann, retired Green Beret, motivational speaker and leadership consultant. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Robert.
Scott, you have your own podcast, the Scott Mann podcast, and you have been all over the place with talking to people about some of the topics we're going to talk about today and about your recent release books that are out there. But I want to talk about you first and your background. I want our listeners to know the person you are, where you came from. So can you go through some of your experience?
Yeah, thanks. It's really great to be on. I grew up in a little logging town in Mount Ida, Arkansas. Very, very small town. We didn't even have a stoplight. And when I was 14, I met a Green Beret named Mark who came into our soda shop. And as soon as I met the guy, and I was a runt of a kid, pretty bullied, kind of always on the outside looking in. We moved around a lot. As soon as I saw him, Robert, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I didn't even know what he did. I just knew that the way he carried himself, the way that he basically paid attention to me, checked in with me when I went up and talked, because I needed to talk to him, because I knew there was something really different about him. And so he sat down with me and he explained to me about U.S. Army Special Forces, that he was a Green Beret, as they were called. And he helped me understand how they were different than Navy SEALs and Delta Force and these other groups, and that they were really focused on working by, with, and through indigenous populations and helping them stand up on their own. And there was just something about that was so appealing to me. And maybe because of just being a runt and always kind of on the outside looking in, this notion of building relationships and kind of the romantic aspect of going to places that are low trust and high stakes, and, building social capital where it just didn't exist. The kind of the Lawrence of Arabia feel to that just was a lot. And I decided at 14, that's what I was going to do. And that's what I did. I committed to it. And when I was finally old enough to try out, I went through ROTC, got commissioned, did a few years as a lieutenant, and then tried out to be a Green Beret. And it was a long road, a lot of recycles, but I made it. And I spent most of my adult life in 7th Special Forces Group, working by, with, and through indigenous populations from South America to Southwest Asia.
And your last station was Afghanistan before you moved back to the States?
Well, it was off and on, right? During the global war on terror, which was essentially the 20-year war that followed 9/11, 2001, we had major fronts of counterterrorism activity and counterinsurgency work in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Special Forces is a very small community. There's only about 6,500 Green Berets in the whole inventory out of 1.4 million people in the military. You were pretty much allocated to either Iraq or Afghanistan, and you were either, as one of my former commanders said, you were either over there or you were getting ready to go back. And that was kind of your life for 20 years. So yeah, I did three full tours in Afghanistan, and then I did a lot of short trips over there, as we called them, 45 days, couple months, just for what seemed like a decade. And yeah, right before I got out, my last tour there was, I got out in 2013. My last tour was 2010, and a little bit of 2011.
Now, when you transitioned from your military career, you became an author, but one of the things that, before we get into the book, and something to touch upon, when you did, I think your initial podcast, your number one, I think that was when you talked about the very dark times that you were going through and the stress of that. And so, coming from someone that struggled with that as well, and understanding that really hit home for me. And after the Abbey Gate situation, and then the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan, you wrote this book, Operation Pineapple Express. Can we talk about this book, by the way? I mean,
Yeah.
Great book, by
Thank
the way.
you.
Read it, loved it, outstanding.
Thank you. Well, it's almost, all of us have chapters in our lives. And I would say that the chapter in my life, which I do talk about in Operation Pineapple Express, of coming home from military service, was a challenging one for me. I was challenged a lot with my transition. It was difficult. I retired in 2013, thought I was ready for that, retired on my terms. But at the same time, I retired because I had been selected for battalion command. I turned down 3 actually in a row, because I just did not feel right about where things were going in Afghanistan. I felt like we had already bailed at a large degree on village leadership that I had been part of making promises to, about a program called Village Stability Operations, which was really a significant strategic shift in how Green Berets operated in the country. And it worked. It was all about helping communities stand up on their own. And we made a promise to them that we would do that for the long haul. And then we bailed on them. And in fact, I wrote a play about it called Last Out when I got out that kind of showed that abandonment back in 2013 or 2011, 2012. So I felt like I saw it coming, and I left the military because I just didn't want to be part of where things were heading in Afghanistan. I didn't like where a lot of senior leadership was heading and kind of a zero defect mentality. So I got out, and I think getting out, it was on my terms, but I wasn't ready for what transition would be. And my mental health really plummeted quickly. I lost connection to my purpose. I lost connection to my identity as a Green Beret. Back home in Florida, I was kind of padding around my house in my robe and not having showered for a couple of weeks, and just really lost a sense of who I was. And coupled that with the fact that a country that I didn't even recognize anymore, it was so divided and disconnected. To me, it looked more like Afghanistan than America. And I think Sebastian Junger in his book Tribe really summed it up, that most combat veterans are more than willing to die for their country. They just don't know how to live for it. And it's hard to know how to live for a country that's tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from race to religion to politics. And all of that just conspired to put me in a really dark place where I almost took my life. I got really close to that. It was a very, very difficult time for me, 2013, 2014, and found a mentor who helped me leverage storytelling as a modality for healing. And I fell in love with storytelling for healing myself, but then teaching it to other veterans, first responders, and it became he was kind of the new Mark for me in the soda shop like that. And that's what I was doing when Afghanistan collapsed in 2021, which was, kind of another chapter where the country of Afghanistan fell without warning. And a lot of the veterans from that war found ourselves trying to help friends that were abandoned, Afghan allies who were abandoned. My friend was Nizam and others. And Operation Pineapple Express is the story of that 11-day effort by a range of veterans, active duty members, and other volunteers to help our friends and get them out of a country that had been abandoned by the United States government.
Hey, has that ever really happened before? I mean, Vietnam happened, and that country, they could see that it was starting to fall apart as it went, but it didn't go as quickly as Afghanistan did. And have we ever abandoned a country like that before, that we
Yeah,
were
I
in
think
for 20 years?
not to that scale and not to that effect. I think it was the worst wholesale abandonment of an ally in American history, probably in modern history. It was really terrible. And I think it stands alone as that. However, America, unfortunately, has, and I said this in my congressional testimony, has a history of multi-generational institutional abandonment of our allies. I mean, if you wanted to, you could look at how we left Tehran, when it fell apart. Look at Afghanistan when the Soviets came in the 70s. Look at the Kurds in Iraq. Look at the Iraqi police and military under the Obama administration when ISIS stood back up. Look at, of course, Afghanistan. Unfortunately, look at the Montagnards and others in Vietnam. Yeah, we have a multi-generational habit of bailing on our allies when it becomes politically inconvenient. And that is a major problem. It is a major, major problem for a range of reasons. One, our credibility in the world. If you did that as a friend, like, let's just break it down. If you did that to your friends, if you left your friends every time it got difficult or a little inconvenient, not only would you be alone in the world, but you would have a reputation that no one would come to your aid when you needed it. And I think that that's part of the problem is we tend to think about organizational or national relationships differently than we do from what our parents taught us as kindergartners. If you go into places and you build relationships like we built in Afghanistan, and then you just pretend like a ServPro commercial, like it never even happened, then you are setting yourself up for massive risk in terms of social capital in the world. But in Afghanistan, it's one step further because we abandoned the place that originated 9/11 and we ceded it back to the very terrorists who started that whole 20-year war. And so Vietnam, I tell people the abandonment difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan is Vietnam didn't follow us home the way Afghanistan would.
And we're going to talk about that in particular, especially about the lack of the over horizon intelligence that we don't have based on what's going on there. So before we get into that, I want to talk about your other book, Nobody's Coming to Save You. Again, great book. And again, hit home for me because of the issues that I've dealt with in my lifetime, in my career. Let's talk about that. It seems it carries a different perspective. It's really internally focused for you and about self-reliance and resilience,
It
right?
is. I mean, that's what the title implies. I think, nobody's coming to save you, and it certainly, I do believe that is at the heart of where we are today in what I call this time of churn. We are living today, Robert, in unprecedented conditions. And I know a lot of your viewers and listeners, particularly in what you all do, with putting information out into the world, right? You've got to notice that the world is different. The arena is different. There's a level of distraction and a level of disengagement or absence of purpose and a level of division, even bordering on distrust, where we're disconnected from one another. And I call that the churn. It's an unprecedented set of social conditions where it is very difficult to connect with people in ways that we normally would have 5 years ago. I mean, take elections. You can't have a conversation around the family table at a holiday period over an election without possibly losing a friendship or a relative. I mean, everything is catastrophized. Everything is emotionally elevated. People are in this trance-like state, as Dr. Ivan Terrell calls it, of emotional arousal around fear and anger that is very tribal, very dangerous. And so I call that the churn. And what Nobody is Coming to Save You is about is similar to what a lot of Green Berets have had to face in, seeing a churn in Afghanistan. You would expect that. You wouldn't necessarily expect it in a first world country like America, where there's abundance and we have a rule of law and a civil society that is about free will, right? But yet we are going completely tribal. We are almost going off a cliff, in my opinion. So I wanted to write this book to call out the churn as the enemy. The Republican across from you, the Democrat across from you is not the enemy. Those conservatives and liberals have coexisted in civil society for thousands of years. The churn, these unprecedented set of social conditions, that's the enemy. And the antibody to that churn is what I call the human operating system. It is that ancient primal human within each of us that is based on meaning and emotion and social connection and storytelling and struggle. And that's what this book is about. It is about ways that we can tap into our primal selves and leverage the strategic components of meaning and emotion and social capital and storytelling and struggle to be better parents, better teachers, better leaders in a time of division and disconnection.
Yeah, I don't think you could say it any better, Mike. The amount of vitriol that happens between just the general public, the like you said, you could lose family at a dinner
Yeah.
conversation, and you can't even have a back and forth and agree to disagree anymore. It's who's going to yell the loudest, who's going to push you around, or who's going to, in some cases, actually physically assault you for
Yeah.
whatever your beliefs are.
It is an elevated, and here's the thing, man. It's not isolated. I mean, if you look around, it's a collective state. I call it shadow tribalism, where we are reverting back to in groups and out groups, demonstrating fear-based behavior. Because what happens is when humans become afraid, we draw back into our groups of who looks like us, thinks like us, talks like us, and we circle wagons with them, and everybody else becomes those people over there, those Republicans, those Democrats. And we speak with contempt normally reserved for one's enemies, according to Sebastian Junger. And when you start speaking with contempt to people who think differently than you, who have a different political opinion than you, you are not far from running off the cliff. And the part that really worries me is that our leaders are the number one contributors to this. On both sides of the aisle, you see leaders, I call them divisionists, who rather than being stewards of bridging us together and human connection, which is what my book's about, they are actually fomenting in-group and out-group division to advance a narrow agenda. It is the most irresponsible thing a leader in a free civil society can do, particularly a democracy or a republic. Because what you're actually doing is fomenting tribalism. And the end game of that is so predictable and so dangerous. And while it might work for your short-term agenda, the long-term effect is massive. And I think it is honestly one of the things I talk about towards the end of my book. I think hopefully we're kind of moving towards an upswing in our country where people are getting tired of that. And we're starting to come together and say, you know what? I'm not good with that. And I hope this book helps people have tools to bridge and connect in this churn and navigate it in a way that we can come back together, not in a kumbaya kind of way, but in a, if we don't, we're going off a cliff kind of way.
And I see I see if we don't get off of it, that this country will be in some kind of civil war, regionally, just simply based off of what's from major cities to smaller communities. The state that I live in Illinois, it's pretty much run by everybody in Chicago or Cook County. Everything outside of Cook County, they don't want to be, they're not looked at as even important. So as a result, you have viewpoints from downstate Illinois, central Illinois, that are completely different than what's going on in the one major county in Cook County. And as a result, some counties want to secede from the state.
Yeah.
They've begun that.
And I will tell you, again, this is where I always I look at my career as a Green Beret. I mean, by definition, Green Berets get dropped into countries that are in an active insurgency, right? Where a civil war is in play. And I will tell you, I've never been to a country where that ends well. Because I hear people talk civil war and stuff, and I'm like, the thing is, if we go down that road, the level of violence and the level of cost on us as Americans is something you can never pull back. Because, see, we take for granted, Robert, like right now, rule of law. We take for granted that you can take your child to the doctor and get a routine medical exam, or maybe a medical exam that is urgently needed, or cancer treatment. But understand that all of those things are out the window. Once, any kind of active organizational or societal violence starts to take root, and in groups and out groups are now the dominant force in the country and not the rule of law, it is very difficult to ever get that back again. And the level of and this is where I think people don't understand, and they allow rigid ideology to start to go into talk of civil war and violence. And I'm like, hey man, you go down that road, that is a road you don't come back from. And this is why we need pragmatic, bottom-up leadership to start calling out divisionist leaders for what they're doing, illuminating bad behavior. Anything to me that divides us as a people by design is bad behavior, and it needs to be called out. And we need to not tolerate those people as leaders. We need to vote them out, get them the hell out of there, and let's get pragmatic people back in offices, back in formal positions of responsibility that understand we might have differences, but there's no pathway down in-group, out-group behavior. And we make bridging. I mean, look at our myths in America, like e pluribus unum, out of many come one. When's the last time you heard a politician actually talk?
Yeah, long time.
Right.
Long time.
And we need to start demanding that again. I don't know if it's a third party. I don't know what it is, but I am woefully underwhelmed right now by both parties in terms of how they are uniting this country. And the short-term answer is to blame the other party. Well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, if you think about it, that's not how we live our lives. Most communities I've ever been to, you're not split down the middle 50-50. I mean, people don't go to the market and, this side of the aisle is this people, but it could get that way.
Yeah.
It could get that way. And I just think we need to reclaim our agency as individuals. We need to come out of this trance state. We need to shake it off. And we need to get back to putting a premium on human connection. And what I'm saying is our instincts are not enough. I wrote Nobody's Coming to Save You because the churn is so diabolical that you need a new mindset, skill set, and tool set for better connections, deeper connections. And that's what this book can help you with.
And I think I've seen some of that at local level politics, where you've started to see some of the local level politicians, the new ones coming up, that have taken a different perspective about things, that are willing to be open-minded and willing to work with multiple groups and people instead of just the same old. So there is some change that I've seen, but it's going to take an awful lot to get the entrenched, Republican, Democrat, whatever you want to call them, that entrenched mentality of it's their fault every 4 years or every 2 years, and it's not my fault.
You're not going to save the country that way. I'm sorry, but I would challenge anybody on this podcast. Like, did you wake up? Have you ever woken up in your life in the morning and go, yes, thank God for Washington, D.C. Woo! Like, I don't think I have. I don't care who's in power. I don't wake up just thinking, man, my life is demonstrably better today because of those politicians in Washington, D.C. Like, For the bulk of our lives are either better or worse based on the agency that we demonstrate in our own life, in our own arena, the neighbors that we're connected to, local politics, leaders without titles. You know, we live and die by community. And I'm not saying that national politics isn't important, but what I'm saying is we've allowed the churn, the 24/7 news cycle, social media, and divisionist leaders to think that somehow those federal leaders are our saviors. And there's not a time in history where that's been true. I mean, if you really unpack what makes America unique is that it is bottom-up leadership. It's leaders at a grassroots level who have made the difference, and politicians mostly being shamed into coming along behind them. You know, and so I just don't subscribe to it. I don't subscribe to this notion that somehow I'm going to divest my agency into a federal politician that's going to save my life or make my life better for my children and my wife. I don't buy it. And I don't care who it is. And I think if we can start to just really reconnect with one another with intention and skill, we'll kind of shake this trance off and realize that what we've needed is in front of us all along. But we're diving into the social media, the mobile devices, and the 24/7 news cycle with so much emphasis that we are surrendering our own freedom, our own autonomy to a bunch of leaders and a bunch of digital engineers that are basically playing us as chumps in an attention-based economy.
I want to switch this conversation up to talk about your most recent book, The Gathering Storm. I want to talk about this. You had interviewed Sarah Adams on your podcast several episodes ago, former CIA analyst, targeter and analyst. She echoed your concern as well. You wrote this book because it's a call to reality, and especially for here in the U.S. And I've always said when things were going on in Iraq and in Afghanistan and the military was there fighting there, that was keeping whatever was there from coming here. So what sparked this concern other than what I know Sarah said this, but what specific observations or trends had led you to this viewpoint that we have to be worried about what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I will tell you, I didn't want to write The Gathering Storm. It was not in my plan. It's not in my, I love to write books. I love to tell stories. I love to do plays. The Gathering Storm was never on my radar as a book I wanted to write. I retired from the military in 2013. I let my security clearance lapse for a reason. I'm not interested in government activities. I'm just not. It's not my thing. I'm a business owner. I'm a nonprofit leader. You know, I'm an advocate, but I'm not a government person, nor am I really involved in counterterrorism. And I tell you that because that book was never supposed to be written. If you notice, you won't see a signature on that book. It says by Scott Mann or Sarah Adams, because we made a decision like it's really just a duty to warn the American people that has not been put out. And to your point, to your question, you know, I felt like I got drawn back into the whole Afghanistan thing in 2021 based on the abandonment and the collapse in the country and the way we abandoned our allies. It was inadvertent. It was unintentional. It was trying to help one friend, Nizam, and then it spun into other friends and eventually Task Force Pineapple. And then once Abbey Gate happened and, you know, everything shut down with the non-combatant evacuation, and you had 100,000 Afghans here, some vetted, some not, many of them just thrown on planes with no rhyme or reason, which, you know, for us, the people we presented were folks we had served with. So we felt like we could at least responsibly present commandos, special forces, interpreters who we had worked with and we could vouch for. A lot of the people that came over, that did not happen. So now fast forward 4 years, so I've got friends that I've continued to help in safe houses, and the network that came together around the abandonment was a veteran network that unlike anything I've ever seen, mostly in a signal room, some pre-existing relationships, some new. But if you stop and think about these thousands of veterans, Robert, that were paying for safe houses, food drops, babies to be born, medicine over the 4-year period to keep these Afghan allies alive. Now, who were they keeping alive? Well, many of them were part of the 98% of the human intelligence apparatus that was abandoned. So, and then many others were Afghan special operators. So these individuals have tradecraft, they have access and placement, and they were once some of the most highly vetted, reliable assets in the intelligence community. But when the U.S. government shut the door on them and turned the lights off, they no longer had any info from those individuals, and those individuals didn't trust the U.S. government anymore. who they began to trust were the veterans who were paying for their safe houses and keeping their families alive. And they started to feed them and us information about the reemergence of Al Qaeda, about the notion that Osama bin Laden's son Hamza is not dead as originally believed. He is in fact alive and at the helm and leading Al Qaeda toward retribution for the death of his father and the impact of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, by saying that and working more in the shadows. We started to hear from members of the Afghan resistance who were abandoned by the United States, telling us there's 28 terror groups in Afghanistan, and ISIS-K is alive and well, and there's 1,000 hardcore, deep cover Taliban and ISIS operatives in the United States, and they are very close to a plot in the United States, similar to what you saw at the Crocus Music Hall in Russia. October 7 was a dress rehearsal. So we're getting all that, and I'm like, what the hell is going on, man? Like, this is insane. And I mean, we're getting this on our MacBooks and our iPhones. We don't even have, I don't even have a security clearance. But at the same time, when we tried to warn the Biden administration on it, it fell on deaf ears. In many cases, some of the veterans are claiming that their sources were killed by trying to report this. So when the Trump administration came in, we tried to let them know as well. And ultimately, I've just been underwhelmed, honestly, by both administrations, all the presidential administrations' prosecution of the Afghanistan war. But I also feel like there has not been the kind of response that I would expect to a highly trusted GWAT veteran saying, hey, there's a problem, and it's not being reported in your intelligence community, so we're trying to warn you. And then people say, well, why doesn't the agency know about this? Why would the three-letter agencies not know? And the reality is, whether you like it or not, we've been giving millions of dollars in aid to the Taliban, formally from the State Department, and counter-terror dollars to the Taliban from the three-letter agencies. And frankly, they view them as a counter-terror partner now. The Taliban, the Haqqani network, are now counter-terror partners of the United States government. So it's like the Twilight Zone, right? So I'm just sitting there. I looked at my wife and I'm like, I can't, in good conscience, watch another 9/11 happen when we're getting this kind of information that the dashboard is smoking. And so I decided, I got with Sarah and a few other contributors, actually a lot of other contributors, and I said, let's just write a book. Let's make it, let's not promote attention on ourselves. Let's just write it. And let's put it out there. Let's do case studies on the community where this has happened before, like Crocus Music Hall, the Beslan school siege in Russia. And let's just break it down and let's show what could happen so that at least people at local and community levels can be thinking about this. And that's why we wrote it.
Scott, this whole thing, like in your book, General McKenzie, commander of the Marine Forces Central Command, said, the result of the loss of the failure of the Afghani government resulted in 98 to 99% of intelligence collection capabilities in the region just disappearing. And you said it before, you said 98%. And since we can't see what's coming over other than what's filtered by the now Taliban anti-terrorist government that they're helping us, we're getting fed baloney, as I'm sure is what we're getting. What do you see that makes us vulnerable here in the country? What are you seeing that sets us up? Because I know what I think I see, but I'd like to hear from you.
I think the number one thing is hubris. Hubris. I mean, it's basically institutional hubris, or if you like, just arrogance. When I looked at 8 case studies, I just asked myself, okay, set the intel aside, because a lot of the intelligence community is going after Sarah Adams and some of the others and saying that her intelligence is inflated and it's not well sourced and just all this other stuff, which I if I didn't subscribe to what she's saying and the veracity of it, I wouldn't have put it in the book. But just set that aside for a second. And let's just say, okay, how did the attack in America start on 9/11? Where did it originate from? Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda. What were the major findings of the 9/11 Commission that had all of these congressional leaders in there doing these harumphs and all this big pomp and circumstance? What did they find? They found that there was poor on-the-ground intelligence. They found that there was no partner force to interdict and that the resistance had been completely ignored as they tried to warn us. They found that there was no interagency cooperation and intel sharing prior to the event, and that all the warnings were there, right? And so this massive report comes out, and then not 20 years later, we abandoned the very things that the 9/11 Commission said were responsible for the attack. And we decide that we're going to somehow partner with the Haqqani network, who is the father of suicide bombing in Afghanistan, and the Taliban. They're going to be somehow in this twilight zone of an arrangement. They're going to be the partners that we get our intel from, and we're not going to listen to the resistance, and we're going to bail on all of those vetted intel assets and those special operators. Okay, that's number one. Then we're going to leave the borders open for 4 years on the heels of this abandonment, and think that Al Qaeda and ISIS are not going to shoot that gap, that they're not going to load those planes up with operatives when they're just bringing them in through the front gate, you know? Haqqani is the Minister of Interior. He owns the passport office in Kabul, right? He has, on Thursday, they have Holy Warrior Thursday, where you can go in and get your travel documents as a jihadist and come to the United States legally. So, I mean, if you just take that, like, set the intel aside, just look at the facts, the indicators, and go, okay, with that in mind, I mean, now let's look at what are the trends of terror attacks across the world. And that's where I pulled out 8 or 9 case studies, like the Beslan school siege, October 7, the DC snipers. But what you see is a growing trend of attacks where we live, work, and play. It's not the spectacular of 9/11 with the World Trade Center and Pentagon. It's the horrorism of hitting a Nova music festival or shooting up a country music festival in Vegas, right? And granted, the ideology is a bit different in all of these, but the application is complex attacks where we live, work, and play. And look at what ISIS just did in Moscow, where they hit that music hall with 7 to 8 highly trained operatives, killed hundreds, knifing them, cutting their throats, setting the place on fire, and then they escaped. You know, they were eventually found, and I had a very high-ranking intel member in D.C. tell me, I can't believe Crocus hasn't happened here in the United States. So for me, it was like, damn, you know, we need to put something out there, because who's going to bear the brunt of this? Local communities are going to bear the brunt. If this manifests in any kind of October 7 or Crocus Music Hall way, the local communities are going to bear the brunt of it. And the fact that we're not, to me, coming together in a private-public partnership kind of way and saying, damn, we've had our head in the sand for the last 4 years. Let's just assume that this could happen, and let's really accelerate our communications with law enforcement, local leaders, communities, and federal government. Like, let's just assume this is possible and be pragmatic and flatten the landscape and get in front of it. That's not happening. And so that was when we decided, all right, we're going to put the book out there and at least have an honest, responsible dialogue with individuals and communities about what has happened to date in other places, so that you might just do some thoughts on it.
You know, and the tactics that can be used or that will be used. You talked about this in the book pretty heavily. You talked about 8 to 10 man teams going in and holding a location. That's not something that we deal with on a regular basis here in law enforcement. We do deal with the active shooter situation, but when you have trained personnel that are now fighting back and shooting back at the police as they're responding, or they've set up IEDs outside the building to take out the first responders. Again, that's something we've never experienced. The attack on January 1st in New Orleans with the ISIS driver driving down the road, just using a vehicle as a tool to kill and horrify people. I think you're right. I think we are very vulnerable here as a country, and even more so now than ever before, because what's the number that is estimated inside the U.S. potentially?
Two separate reliable sources have told me personally 1,000. Now, there were 19 hijackers on 9/11, right? And then the other thing to think about, like you cited the January 1. I mean, there were 2 IEDs that didn't go off, right? How would that have changed things? Granted, of late, what we've seen in the United States are lone wolf style attacks. However, if you look at, let's just take ISIS-K. You know, ISIS-K has developed a propensity they wanted to show they could strike Russia, and they did. You know, look at what they did on Abbey Gate. They're not scared of us. They're not scared of pissing us off. You know, they killed, 13 of our service members right there in broad daylight. I mean, they have no problem provoking us. And you better believe we can debate all day long whether Al Qaeda is relevant or not, whether the Taliban are a CT partner or not. But ISIS-K has an overt desire to strike the United States and for retribution and payback. And they've already demonstrated in Russia that a 7 to 8 man team did that with brutal efficiency. And so you think they don't have deep cover operatives in the United States after the last 4 years of an open border, Haqqani as the Minister of Interior, and planes that flew 100,000 Afghans out of one little postage stamp airport in mass chaos? You know, I mean, it boggles my mind that we are not at a private, public, multi-echelon level scrambling on this, on a homeland piece. But we're not, and I think that comes down to hubris. I think that just comes down to arrogance. One other thing I'll share with you, look at October 7. Look at what happened on October 7. Look at the way a country that Israel that is always ready, always front-footed. I interviewed dozens of first responders and intel professionals from October 7, and they all said the same thing: institutional hubris, arrogance, even arrogance in neighborhoods that this could not happen when the indicators were there, right? The videos were surfacing, but no one thought it could happen. And in all 8 case studies that I did, Robert, every single one, from the Beslan school siege to the DC snipers to January 1st to Crocus City Music Hall to the Bellagio, in every after action review, it was always the same: hubris. No one thought it was possible. No one thought it could happen. And the level of hubris right now in the United States around this topic, and the fact that the institutions actually get pissed off at guys like me and Sarah, who are bringing it up for pragmatic discussion, should be, that speaks volumes to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and you in your book you also talked about that false sense of security, that belief that we're fine here, we have law enforcement. But again, if you look at the vast majority of law enforcement agencies here, the average agency in a community is between 60 and 100 is your average law enforcement agency. 5 to 7 working per shift in a community where they might have a mall and shooting starts to happen.
Yeah,
there's not
exactly.
a whole lot here to protect you.
No, in fact, if you look at, like, I interviewed Doron Kaidar, who's a special forces operator from the IDF who responded on October 7. And he told me, he said, they ran right at us. They ran right at our police substations. They ran right at our command posts, and they overwhelmed them. Now imagine that. Imagine if fire stations and police stations were actually targeted and hit right out of the gate. Imagine if drones were employed. Is that such a stretch, considering that even Fox News has reported the cartels employing drones? Imagine if we start to actually surgically target the cartels in Mexico, and now they have nothing to lose, right? So a nexus actually forms with ISIS-K because they have nothing to lose business-wise now. They're now targeted just like ISIS is. What will be their play in this? Will drones then become possible? Are we expecting to see now more, lethal munitions employed in the United States? And then finally, if you just look at the case studies, for example, on October 7, or in Beslan when they hung explosives in a gymnasium and put children in that gymnasium for so many days they were drinking their own urine. They, just dehumanize these kids. The paralysis that occurred to what you talked about, when you start to see that level of carnage, Mumbai, a city of 19 million people, was locked down for 10 days by 10 highly trained operatives who killed hundreds, but they locked the whole city down. DC, I interviewed Sheriff Chris Nacco on my podcast. He said the entire city of DC was locked down by 2 snipers shooting from the back of a car. Now put those snipers with 10 operatives who are poised after an IED goes off, and then they're shooting down into choke points. The level of overwhelm that's going to have on local law enforcement and first responders is staggering. And we've got to start thinking about that. We've got to start thinking about institutional paralysis as a contingency. This is why I think it's so important to start having conversations with communities, with global war on terror veterans, with people that have done mass casualties in Fallujah and Ramadi who are highly trained in dealing with that. The level of just casual hubris around this is staggering to me. And I think we'll look back on it and we'll be sad that it was there.
Yeah. Scott, for our audience of public information officers who are often in the front lines communicating during a crisis, what are some considerations or preparations that they should be making in light of this concern that's being raised here?
Anything around private-public partnership. Scenario-based thinking. My God, there's enough, we've talked about enough just on this show that I think any pragmatic person could say, wow, yeah, you know what? That's certainly enough to warrant scenario-based contingency conversations at a private-public level. What do I mean by that? Bring the dadgum communities together with law enforcement, state and local leaders, Homeland Security, and start having flat, collaborative conversations around hard, uncomfortable topics. Why in the world can we not bring lessons learned from October 7 over here? Doron Kaidar is traveling around the country on his own dime, talking to churches and communities about what he saw over there because he's so concerned it's coming here. I mean, those to me are the things that information officers could really help with. Also, how are you going to communicate in this crisis? How are you going to get word out on what's really going on? What if these guys are wearing body cams like they did? How are you going to prevent veterans like they did in Western North Carolina during the hurricane from just running into these buildings if their kids are in there? Maybe you don't prevent it. I don't know. But like, information and response is going to be paralyzed if you don't start having scenario-based conversations across the private-public gap while risk is low. If you try to figure it out when risk is high, it's predictable. And all you got to do is read those case studies to see how it's going to go.
Scott, in your experience, what are some of the common communication failures that happen when it goes bad? Where do you think that a PIO might learn from those failures that you're aware of?
I think a lot of it is understanding that, first of all, that the effect that a group like ISIS is going to want is horrorism. They're going to want to paralyze our ability to even function by doing stuff that is so localized and horrific that it puts us into a state of shock and it overwhelms the system. So our ability to talk to ourselves is going to be paralyzed. The first responders' inability to respond will then put the communities on their own, and the communities will feel isolated and alone, and individuals will feel isolated and alone. And that's what ISIS and these other groups want. They want you to feel powerless. They want you to feel like you are at their mercy, and then they will broadcast what they want you to see. Now, that's their MO. If you don't believe me, look at what they did in Crocus. Look at what they did just recently in Kashmir. Right? Just happened in Kashmir. So this is the MO. So if I'm a information professional, I want to look at that first. I want to start with that. And then I want to work backwards. I want to unpack that and say, all right, let's just do like systemic analysis, systems analysis on this. What are the critical functions that we need to overcome that? What's the center of gravity here? And a lot of it, again, it seems to me, is developing contingency communications plans on how you communicate during these moments. How are we going to do that? How are you going to communicate, for example, if bad guys are dressed as first responders like they did on October 7th? Yeah. How are you going to communicate that across the spectrum? I think what we tried to do in the book, because I don't have the answers, is we tried to pose questions that professionals like yourselves and your association can start to unpack through hard conversations in private public settings at community levels. But that's where it's going to get solved. And so I would say, get into Gathering Storm, read the book, read the challenging questions we pose, because there's sections in there on communications. I know it. Go in there and unpack those and start sorting it out, because it's the only way, and do it while risk is low right now. Don't wait until the crisis, because then you're going to be dealing with collective paralysis and it's going to be almost impossible.
Scott, can we talk about mindset, skill set, and tool set and how it pertains to preparedness for the country and the population?
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, I think mindset is the antibody to it's going the opposite way of hubris, is just stepping back and saying, okay, if we were talking about a hurricane or tornadoes, we wouldn't hesitate to do this level of preparation. Why in God's name are we being so casual about terrorism? Certainly with the level of precedent that's happening around the world. And the reporting that's coming out of it. Why would we just stick our head in the sand? That's a change in mindset, is just coming to a collective and individual realization that this is the world we live in. What President Trump talks about, these two beautiful oceans that separate us, that's just not true. That's not true. That is not a reason to draw security. Or a comfortable way of thinking. So I think that kind of we've got to reset our mind and go, all right, there is truly a chance that there is something diabolical in the country that could happen, and we need to start getting ready for it. And the other part of mindset is stop thinking that because if it's your lane is the only one that can handle it. Some of the rice bowls and parochialism that go with this are the very things that came out of the 9/11 Commission. We've got to flatten those landscapes, and we've got to have hard conversations. That's the mindset. The skill set, I believe, honestly, that I'll talk about here. I mean, there's individual and tactical and medical skills that I'm not really qualified to talk about. Even though I was an SF, I'm not the guy for that. I do believe skill set wise, though, it's about human connection. It's about building community resilience now. It's about bringing in communications and medical response and all of those things that we will need as a community. Trauma intervention. that's the skills that but it all is around how we connect with each other right now. And then the tool sets, to me, the most important tool sets are community forums. That's the tool right now is Signal, virtual community, but also physical community, town halls. Those are tools that are available to us right now. But then also looking at things like ham radio, triage kits for communities, neighborhoods. How are we going to protect our vulnerable schools? What are the tools that we need for that? How are firefighters going to communicate across counties when we know that even when a flood happens, they have trouble communicating? So when I think about tools, I would look at not just like radios and weapons, and I would also think of your forums as tools. And I would also think about the platforms by which you communicate. Like this is a tool for getting the word out, but so are forums, so is Signal, and so are ham radios.
Scott, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and your perspective today. Where can our listeners learn more about your books and your ongoing work? Obviously, there's the Scott Mann podcast.
Yeah.
That's an obvious one.
Yeah, a couple places. So my focus right now is really on leadership and human connection. Scottmann.com, 2 T's, 2 N's. My whole body of work is there. I've also started a community on School, which is an online learning platform, SKOOL, and it's called the Scott Mann Leadership Academy. It's free. I encourage people to go in there. It's a wonderful community of leaders that are just finding ways to make deeper human connections around topics like this, but other things too. It's just about reclaiming our connections with one another. So Scottmann.com, Scott Mann Leadership Academy on School, either one of those. And then, of course, the podcast. Yeah, the Scott Mann podcast, which comes out once a week on Tuesday.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Any key points you want to share to sum it all up for the followers?
The key point that I would leave with is if you look at every event that's happened in American history, whether it's a hurricane, a fire, a train derailment, a community is at the heart of how we deal with it every single time. This is no different. Communities will be at the heart of how we deal with a violent extremist threat. However, because of the churn we talked about early on and the division in the country, we've got to come together on the front end of this left of bang before it happens. And that's where individual leaders can really play a role, is the resilient potential of communities to deal with this. So let's bring communities together, not in a chicken little sky is falling kind of way, but in a pragmatic and well-informed kind of way, in concert with federal and local and state authorities. Like that's it. That's the way to do it. And then I think that's a really, really solid approach. And I think that it is the best way. I mean, this thing could happen. It could happen tomorrow and we're not ready, but that's the best way to have the best chance we can.
Scott, you summed it up great. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity and your willingness to do this interview. And I hope my listeners and followers take some of this and bring it back to their home agencies and share it and get the conversation going in the communities.
Yeah. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate that.
Scott, you be safe, man.
All right. We'll catch you around.